Lifelong Learning, A Taste of Pillar 2 are short presentations taught by PILLAR instructors in partnership with the Pikes Peak Library District. This program is made possible as the result of a grant from Next 50 Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding innovative, mission-driven initiatives that improve the lives of older adults and their caregivers. This is Xu Beihong, the world famous artist you probably never heard of. One of the funny stories is that I actually gave this presentation at a Mensa convention, and I had a gentleman come up to me afterwards and he says, about Chinese pronunciation. And he says, I don't know if you know how to really pronounce his name, Xu Beihong. And I says, I think I know how to pronounce it because I actually spoke to Xu Beihong's daughter and verified that I was pronouncing it correctly. And she assured me that, yes, in fact, I was pronouncing it correctly. So yes, in fact, it is pronounced Xu Beihong. So without further ado, my first introduction to Xu Beihong was actually, years ago, there's a Safeway down at South Nevada and Southgate. There's a Safeway way down south there. There was actually a Chinese restaurant there at one time, years and years ago in the mid-70s. And they had this beautiful hooked rug, just a hooked rug on the wall as you went into the place. And it had this very stylized horse on it. Well, I just fell in love with this rug. The Chinese restaurant got torn down. I transferred away, blah, blah, blah. But I always remembered that rug. And I always thought that horse on this rug was just so beautiful. And this was very similar to that horse that I saw on that rug. Well, Mike and I were stationed in Germany, and I saw this small picture. It's very small. It's maybe 12 by 12 at a flea market in Germany. And I went, those horses look very similar to what I saw on this hooked rug. The style was very, very similar. So I purchased it for just like 5 mark or whatever, just a few bucks. Well, we didn't have internet there, but when we got back to the States and internet became very prevalent and everything else, I did some research on this small little picture of these horses that I bought in Germany. And I found out the artist on this was Xu Beihong. And the picture that I had purchased was called Group of Horses. He did this in 1940, and it was ink and color on paper. And it actually hangs, the original picture hangs in the Xu Beihong Memorial Museum. Well, I had no idea who Xu Beihong was, but I liked that hooked rug. I liked the horse pictures. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I got this picture by this Chinese artist in this little flea market in Germany. Well, I got to looking in more to this artist, and he had also done this painting called 6 Galloping Horses. He did this in 1941, and this is another one that's at the Xu Beihong Memorial Museum, which is in Shanghai, I believe. No, Beijing, sorry, Beijing. And this is a huge painting. This thing is like 6 foot by 18 foot. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. But it's again, these horses. So I'm going, this Xu Beihong's pretty cool. He draws lots of horses. Here's another one that he did in 1930. This is a watercolor that's in Taipei, 3 horses. So I'm thinking, this is what this guy does, is draws horses. But I did more and more study on Xu Beihong. And he also did traditional Chinese painting, like this one called Double Happiness. These magpies. Very pretty, very colorful, very traditional Chinese ink on paper. So this is traditional Chinese group happiness with the ducks and the little dog. So he did horses, he did animals. And then I find this, he did Sound of the Flute. And I hope you can see this good enough, but this is oil on canvas. He did this in 1926. This is in the style of European oil masters. And like Rembrandt, all these guys with the oil painting and the colors and what he did. So I'm going, this guy's getting more and more interesting as an artist. He also did portraits. This is one of the portraits that he did. Portrait of Miss Jenny. She was a Cantonese dance hostess from Singapore. And this was actually a painting that was commissioned by the Vice Consul of Belgium to Singapore. So a little bit about Xu Beihong and his background. He was born in 1895 in the Jiangsu province in China, just a little bit west of Shanghai here, fairly near the coast. He was very, very poor, born to a very poor family. He was well educated by his father, though. His father grew melons, that grew up on a melon farm of all things. But his father was an artist and a calligrapher. And Xu Beihong himself actually started learning calligraphy and portraiture around the age of 9 years old. He worked on his farm, but he also helped his father with painting and with calligraphy. And of course, at that time, there was no cameras, but people had their portraits done by this village artist, Xu Beihong's father. He married a girl. It was an arranged marriage about when he was 17 or 18 years old. His father around that time became very ill, and the total support of his family falls onto Xu Beihong. His father dies, and he goes to Shanghai to study art. He leaves his home village, and his wife, who was already this arranged marriage wife, she was already in poor health. He really, according to one source, in fact, the only source that I found on this, it was not a pleasant arrangement for Xu Beihong. And his wife died. They had one son who died of smallpox shortly after being born. So already at a very young age, he's in Shanghai. His young wife and son die. He continues to paint prolifically, sending money home to his mother in village. And I couldn't find any information on any siblings, but he continues to paint prolifically. Landscapes, portraits, animals, lots of birds. His talent was brought to the attention of a local university in Shanghai, and he was invited to lecture there, of all things. The university officials, when they actually met Xu Beihong, could not believe that this young man had such talent at such a young age, and they invited him to lecture there. They were absolutely astounded at his talent. And in anticipation of further studies, he goes to night school and he learns to speak French, because at that time, a lot of the Chinese artists were going to France to study in Europe. This is one of the self-portraits that he did in 1922. And you can even see in the background, this is the start of his famous horses, what he does with his horse, a lot of horse drawings. So he's in Shanghai. He's studying some art. He's actually already teaching some art and calligraphy and studying French in anticipation of going to Paris. In Shanghai, of course, there's always a woman involved. And I got to tell you, this guy's life is a soap opera. Keep that in mind, okay? It's a soap opera. He meets Chang Bi-wei, who she's actually engaged to another man. In 1917, okay, so he is 5'17", he's 22 years old. He leaves for Japan. He marries Chang Bi-wei and takes her with him. Now, her real name was Chang Tangzhen, but she changes her name in order to conceal her whereabouts because she's actually engaged to another man. So we get the honor thing going on here, okay? Great scandal for her family that she runs off with a Xu Beihong. In fact, her family claims that she had dies. They even build a coffin, fill it with stones, have a funeral for her. Okay, again, soap opera here, soap opera here. So while they're in Japan, Xu Beihong he has a great love of art, and Chang Bi-wei, now they're married, she realizes that she will always be second in his life, that art will always come first. And this is a bone of contention throughout their married life, that Xu Beihong will always put art ahead of her. Okay, so Xu Beihong studies Japanese art as much as possible. The guy is a sponge for art. He lives and breathes art, 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 art. He buys art. He buys art book. He buys art supplies. Chang Bi-wei is not real happy about this because, again, she's second, money-wise and love-wise. Jiang Bi-wei complains about how much he spends on art supplies, books. And like I said, it's a bone of contention throughout their relationship. Here's a drawing of Chang Bi-wei, 1925, on oil that he did of her. And here's some, you can see the Japanese influence on his art during this time. This definitely looks more Japanese than Chinese. You can see the cypress trees, the ancient pines and cypress, and it's definitely got a Japanese look to it, if you will. And this is another one with the horses. And he did this while he was in Japan. And you can see the trees are a little more Japanese looking, if you will, if you would compare it to a Chinese. In fact, I think, yeah, I actually have two comparisons here. You've got on the left side, you've got the three horses, one of his three horses. And then on the right side, you've got the Japanese influences. You can see the difference in the trees and a little difference in the structure of the horses. So he did so many different styles. The guy was just absolutely amazing. So after about 6 months in Japan, money runs out. They return to China. In Beijing, he continues to study art, but he's realizing that Chinese art was very stagnant. Artists in China at that time were taught to copy and not create. And he always wanted to create, to take art to another level, to use some of his skills, especially with his animals, to interpret, to design, to take them to another level, to give them form and motion. That was a lot of his. He wanted to give animals motion and tell a story with his art. So in 1919, post-World War I, he was actually sent to Paris to study under a Ministry of Education program. He takes his wife, Chang Bi-wei, with him. In Paris, he meets Zhou Enlai. And after a visit to the Louvre, he decides at that point to stop Oriental style painting altogether and devote himself to studying Western masters. That's it. No Oriental, studying Western masters, that's it. So after a couple of months in Paris and seeing the Western masters that he saw in the Louvre, he applied to and was accepted by and I don't speak French, so excuse my accent, the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts. Does anybody speak French? Did I do that okay? So it was a prestigious art school there in France, in Paris, but he applied and was accepted there. So amazing, amazing opportunity for him to expand his art repertoire, if you will. So in 1921, in an effort to make their money last, he drops out of the school and he and Jiang Bi-wei moved to Berlin. The Chinese government, who had been supporting him in Paris at his school, had stopped sending him money because that was the start of the government's, of the Communist Party, of the Communist Party movement in China. So no more money. They moved to Berlin. He wanted to stay in Europe to continue to study art. So they spent 2 years in Germany in an attempt to make the money kind of stretch it out a little bit. He was especially enamored with Rembrandt during this time, and he would spend literally 8 to 10 hours a day painting. And again, they were poor as church mice. They weren't getting a lot of money anyway from China, and the money had stopped coming in from the government. He was trying to sell his art, but at the same time, he was buying books, painting, art supplies, and Chang Bi-wei was not too happy with that. She would always be second when it came to art and Xu Beihong. He also visited the Berlin Zoo a lot to study animals and study their motion and study their forms. And at this time, he was especially enamored with lions, which became one of his more famous subjects. And he did this one, The Slave and Lion. He did this in 1924. This is an oil painting that he did. And again, he was trying to study and emulate the masters, if you will, the European style. And this, I've never seen this. And this isn't, you're looking at a slide, so you're not getting the full effect of what he painted there. But from what I've read, this painting is absolutely just beautiful with the colors and the shades and everything else that he did in the shadows. So you'll just have to take whoever has it, their word for it. And I don't know who actually owns this painting now. Later on, he did, again, the lions became a favorite topic of this. This was from 1938, and this is a wounded lion. This is actually in the Xu Beihong Memorial Museum. And another one of his famous lion paintings, just entitled Lion. And Lions on Snow. And he got all these ideas from when he was in Berlin. Of course, I think he does, but yeah, and I really enjoy his lions are very famous across China. And some of it was, and we'll talk later, some of it is used for propaganda also, and we'll come across that later. In 1923, now he's in Germany, trying to make his money last. In 1923, the Chinese government resumed sending money to him, so he goes back to Paris, re-enrolls in the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts. I got it again, okay. Now, he passes the school's final exam with honors in the history of painting, theory of painting, anatomy, and perspective. Now, at this time, this is 1923, so the guy is, add 5 on that, he's 28 years old. So he's already a master painter, calligrapher. He's graduated from this Paris, one of the superior schools of art in the world. He's graduated with honors from that. He got word that his paintings would do well in Singapore, so he moves there for a short period of time, leaving his wife in Paris. Keep in mind, this is a bit of a soap opera, okay? His wife, Chang Bi-wei, begins an affair with a man named Sang Dauphin. And that affair lasts until Xu Beihong returns to Paris. Now, there's more about this affair later, so keep in mind that Chang Bi-wei has had an affair with this Sang Dauphin guy, okay? So, while he was in Singapore, he did return to China for a visit, painting portraits of old friends and benefactors. And that's really where he got some income from, was painting portraits for friends and painting some paintings for friends and selling them. So he returns to Paris in 1925. So you can imagine the scene in Paris. I mean, he's just, oh my God, he's in heaven in Paris, painting, going to school, selling his portraits, buying art supplies, buying paintings, buying things, buying books. So from 1925 to 1927, he continues to study in Europe. He tours Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, and he is overwhelmed by the masters, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael. He continues to study paintings, and the man is just immersed in art, 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 art. That's all he thinks about. That's all he thinks about. Neglecting, of course, Chang Bi-wei, his wife. And again, this is The Sound of the Flute. He did this in 1926. This is an oil on canvas. And it's amazing, some of the reviews that I have read on this, that this is done in the style of European masters, this oil on canvas, that it's this Oriental subject done in the style of a European master. So it's quite unique in that way. I would love to see the original. If I ever get to China, Xu Beihong Museum is like the top of my list to see this and a couple other of them. So in 1927, he's in Europe. He goes back to Shanghai and is appointed to the board of the Shanghai Art University. So he's 23 years old. He's on the board of an art university in Shanghai. So his art is well thought of, very well thought of in China and in Europe. The university, however, is banned by the French, who controlled that portion of Shanghai. It's a divided city, kind of like we think of Berlin was at one time. And the university's banned by the French because of the communists who are studying there. So he's kicked out of the university because the university is shut down. So once again, he's unemployed and survives by painting portraits. So he paints portraits of friends. He does his paintings, tries to sell his paintings, but there's another art school being established, the Nangao Art Academy, and he becomes one of its directors as well as an instructor there. Now, Chang Bi-wei, who initially remained in Paris, she comes back to Shanghai, and she's pregnant with Xu Beihong's child. They have a son, Xu Beihong, late in 1927. So now Chang Bi-wei and Xu Beihong are now in Shanghai at this time. While he's at the Nangao Art Gallery, Xu Beihong begins to plan one of his most ambitious paintings. And this painting turns out to be one of his, I guess you'd call it, masterpieces. And it's called Tian Heng and His 500 Followers. What he wants to do is he wants to paint a painting that tells a story in the style of a European master. And this is based on a 1st century BC history of the Western Han Dynasty. Tian Heng was a descendant of a noble family, and during a peasant uprising, Tian Heng and 500 comrades held out at an isolated island. An imperial edict demanded that he surrender and be made a duke, or the troops would be sent to kill all 500 soldiers on the island. In order to save the soldiers, Tian Heng left the troops and committed suicide. When the 500 soldiers hear of Tian Heng's death, they refuse to surrender, and they all kill themselves by jumping into the sea. So that's the legend, and Xu Beihong wants to paint this legend. And he does so magnificently. He saw this story as epic to Chinese culture. And I have to say too here, and I'll interject and I'll talk about this later, Xu Beihong loved China. He was a patriot in the sense that he loved Chinese culture and he loved China. He desperately loved China. So he saw this as a tribute to Chinese culture. If he could tell about China through his art and his paintings. So in the spirit of Western art, this Tian Heng and the 500 Followers tells a story. It's a large painting. It's 6.5 feet by 11 feet. So it's huge. It's really big. Took him 2 years to do. And many of the figures in there are portraits. He was a portrait artist. From the time he was 9 years old, he drew portraits. So you would expect him to have portraits in this painting. He appears in the painting. His wife, Chang Bi-wei, appears in the painting. And this is an important one. This is the soap opera part too. His friend, Si Chao Kang, appears in the painting. Now, Si Chao Kang is the father of the Denver Art Museum trustee, John C. John C. was instrumental in getting the Xu Beihong exhibit at the Denver Art Museum in 2011. And there's more on that later, so keep that in the back of your mind, okay? Again, this is all a soap opera. So here's the painting. Can you see that? Now, can you see my mouse moving? See my mouse? This is Xu Beihong. There's his wife, Chang Bi-wei. This is John C., the Denver Art Museum's father, right there. This is the portrait. This is Tian Heng, who's the person who's going to leave to try to save the 500 followers. And these are of course, part of the 500 followers. So he's got portraits of his friends in this painting. So it's a magnificent, magnificent painting. So it's quite the painting to see. But he did portraits of people in the painting. So in 1929, Xu Beihong was invited to become the president of the Beijing College of Art. So you can see he's risen in the art world even more so. It had been 10 years since he had been to Beijing. So now he's the president of the College of Art there. But again, a soap opera element. While he's at the Beijing College of Art, the president, he falls in love with Sun Duosi, a promising art student. He uses Sun Duosi as a subject for some of his art, and their affair becomes well known. Chang Bi-wei, at this point, chose to ignore the affair, and she and Xu Beihong had a daughter, Xu Lily. So, again, this is a soap opera here, and it's all true. So here's a couple of the paintings that survived from Sun Duosi. So here's a couple of her portraits here that he painted of her. So he had an affair with one of his art students. Now, in 1933 to 1934, Xu Beihong organized a modern Chinese contemporary painting exhibit that showed in Paris, Milan, Frankfurt, Moscow, and Leningrad. Chang Bi-wei, his wife, accompanied him on this tour. They took over 200 works of art on this tour for him. So, okay, again, I go, Xu Beihong, the world famous artist you probably never heard of, but they've obviously heard of him in Europe. China knows him. Now you're hearing of him in Europe. It was so successful that the Paris show extended several weeks. And in Moscow and Leningrad, shows there were also extended. So he was very, very well received across Europe, very well received across Europe. And one of the things that was surprising is he was, especially in Moscow and Leningrad, he was actually viewed there by more working class and general population as compared to more scholarly visitors in Paris. But Russians really connected with him. In fact, I tell people, it's easier for me to find books on Xu Beihong in Russian than it is in English. I can find Chinese books on him, I can find Russian books on him, but to try to find English books on him is impossible. So I have several Russian books on him. I can't read Russian, but I can find Russian books on him. So the Russians love him. In fact, I even put here, there's 12 Xu Beihong paintings in the Hermitage and 15 in the Moscow Gallery of Modern Art. I think the Denver Art Museum has one Xu Beihong, maybe. I know occasionally they borrow one to display. You know, there's very few in the United States in museums. But anyway, the working class just really loved Xu Beihong's. And in fact, one painting really seemed to fascinate the Russians as they thought it represented socialism and class distinction. And the Russian exhibit also caused a shift in Xu Beihong's art that he liked. He felt that he could use his art to make statements, not only tell history about China and not only bring stories about China to life, but he could also use it to make statements about China and the people of China. And one of them that they really liked was this one. And I apologize, I cannot find a really good picture of them, but it shows a man on a horse, a man on a burro, and a man pushing a cart. And the Russian people saw this as the classes. You have like a noble on a steed, a peasant on a burro, and then a man pushing a cart. And this is actually from a sonnet from the fourth century. And the sonnet goes, and the inscription, there's an inscription up in the corner of this. And the inscription reads, "He rides a steed, I ride a donkey. It makes me think I'm not as good as he. Turning my head to look back, a man pushing a cart I see." And his original intent behind the painting was to accept one's station in life, but the Soviet audiences read that as a class struggle. And Xu Beihong supposedly said that was his most thought-provoking cultural encounter in the Soviet Union, was this painting. And it made him realize his paintings could make a statement also. And that kind of started him on a little bit of a political bend sometimes in some of his paintings also. Like this one, Poor Woman from Sichuan, where he did a Chinese woman carrying a heavy basket, kind of making a statement about people's hard labor in China and people having to work. Women washing clothes, the everyday life of the peasants and what they did in China. Or this, Sichuan people gathering water. And the inscription on this one reads, "It's hard to watch the Chongqing people carrying loads on their shoulder poles, walking up long distances with hundreds of steps. Every grain of rice on our plates is full of bitterly hard work, sweat, and toil." So he's kind of making a statement there about, you know, our rice is the result of a lot of people working hard toil. So you can see the people down here, the water going all the way up the steps. So he did that kind of thing also. But he didn't abandon his other art either. The large portraits of horses, the telling of stories. So after returning from his tour in Europe, he recognized his paintings could have an impact on his nation. In fact, the term guoha, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correct, or national paintings began to encompass the modern images used in the resistance to Japan, because at this time now, Japan was invading China, and that was the beginning of the China-Japan War. Xu Beihong was on the front lines of the artistic effort to support China and that Chinese patriotism. Like I said, Xu Beihong loved China. He loved being Chinese. He loved his country. And the Chinese war with Japan was expanding. In fact, there was a very popular anti-government play that was adapted to take on anti-Japanese sentiments. And he was commissioned, he painted a life-size portrait of a famous actress performing that play. And this was this one. And the play's title was Put Down Your Whip. And in October 1939, Wang Ying performed Put Down Your Whip in Singapore. And Xu Beihong, who was a friend of the actress, painted a life-size portrait of her performing that play. And in fact, in 2007, that painting was sold for US $9.2 million, setting a record at that time for the highest auction price ever paid for a Chinese painting. World famous artist you never heard of, being sold for $9.2 million. Beautiful, beautiful painting. Great use of colors. Isn't that amazing? Another one, the Wounded Lion. And he did this one, you see the date, 1938. This could be interpreted as a statement about war and the resistance to Japan. You can see China as the lion. I'm the wounded lion, but I'm going to resist. I am still strong. And that was used sometimes as propaganda in China about, I am still going to be resistant. I am still the lion. So some of his paintings was used by Chinese resistance. And this is another one that was used, a spirit of resistance, the small birds flying against the wind. You can see these little birds going against the wind of the reeds bending over. So that's a great one by Xu Beihong. And back to the soap opera here, because it is a soap opera. It was around this time, about 1935, that Xu Beihong and Zhang Biwei, his second wife, separated. They eventually did divorce in 1944. But the side story here is Zhang Biwei became more and more upset with Xu Beihong's continuing affair with Sun Duosi, that art student that he had an affair with. At one point, she destroyed a number of Xu Beihong's paintings, all the ones that featured Sun Duosi, the art student. So she destroyed the paintings. And after they separated, Chang Bi-wei renewed her friendship with Chang Du-fan. Remember who she met in Paris and had an affair with, a short affair with in Paris? Okay. They had a secret affair for several years, both in Paris and in China. In 1949, Chang Bi-wei, Xu Beihong's second wife, and Sang Dauphin, who she had the affair with, they moved to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek. Now, Sang Dauphin was the fourth president of the legislative premier of the Republic of China on Taiwan. Chang Bi-wei lived with him for about 10 years, but they never appeared together in public. In 1958, Chang Dauphin's wife moved from Europe to Taiwan and joined her husband in Taiwan. So that was the end of the affair at that point. Chang Bi-wei's memoirs, 2 volumes. One volume is about her life with Xu Beihong. The second volume is about her life with Chang Dauphin, her affair with him in Paris, and then her life with him in Taiwan. But Sang Dauphin's memoirs never mention her at all. So she devoted her life to basically 2 very powerful, well-known men. And the second one on Taiwan never mentions her, never acknowledges her at all. She eventually died in 1978 in Taipei. So isn't that amazing? So talk about a soap opera life. Oh my God. So isn't that amazing? So, wow. This was another one of these large paintings that Xu Beihong did. This one is, again, he wanted to talk about the Chinese legends and bringing one of those legend stories, if you will, to life. This one is called The Foolish Old Man Removes the Mountains. And this one, he used models for every figure that's in here. And these are all life-size figures. And this is based on a fable where a foolish old man wanted to move 2 mountains and then dig through them. He's told the task is impossible. And he said he may not finish it, but his children and his children's children and his children's children's children would do that. So that someday the mountains would be removed. So the gods in heaven were so impressed that they ordered the mountains separated. And so this is Xu Beihong's interpretation of that story. And it shows all the men and the generations moving the mountains. Now, Mao Zedong recounted the story and interpreted it as, today, 2 big mountains lie like a dead weight on Chinese people. One is imperialism, the other is feudalism. The Chinese Communist Party has long made up its mind to dig them up. We must persevere and work unceasingly, and we too will touch God's heart. Our God is none other than the masses of the Chinese people. If they stand and dig together with us, why can't these 2 mountains be cleared away? So again, as part of Xu Beihong's work is used for propaganda. This is another one of those huge, massive, huge paintings. It's not a small piece. The figures are all life-size. Now, during World War II, Xu Beihong traveled to Southeast Asia to raise funds for war relief. Again, he was very dedicated to China and the Chinese people. He held exhibits in India, Singapore, and Burma. He gave talks and lessons in art school. He sold paintings. All the proceeds went to Chinese relief efforts. In 1940, he was invited to lecture in West Bengal and India. He met Mohandas Gandhi. Again, world famous artist you never heard of. He's been to Europe, China, Russia, Southeast Asia. He exhibited in India and Kuala Lumpur. This is a sketch that he did, a charcoal sketch that he did of Gandhi. And according to Xu Fangfang, his daughter, he literally drew this within minutes, just freehand sketch within minutes, this little charcoal drawing. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's actually signed by Gandhi. And he did this in 1940, this oil of Gandhi. This is in a private collection. It's absolutely beautiful, just gorgeous. So you can see just right there from the little charcoal sketch to this beautiful oil painting, what talent the man has. He also did this, the Himalayan mountains. I just love this. Just love this painting of the Himalayan mountains. And he also did this one, a view of the Himalayas. So you can see that the contrast, the difference that he did, ink on paper versus an oil. I mean, the guy was just amazingly talented. In 1941, American aid to the China Federation invited Xu Beihong to the United States for an exhibit. There were some photos and some exhibit items shipped to the United States. And in November 1941, the paintings were packed and waiting for shipment in Singapore. On December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And on December 8th, the Japanese attacked Singapore. Xu Beihong had left Singapore that night and left all his work there. The school where they had stored the paintings, the school destroyed 40 paintings, fearful of being implicated in Xu Beihong's anti-Japanese propaganda efforts. So those 40 paintings that were slated to be exhibited in New York City were destroyed. Can you imagine? Now, what paintings do you take to your first exhibit in the United States? You take your best pieces. All 40 pieces were destroyed. There would be no Xu Beihong exhibit in the United States until October 2011 at the Denver Art Museum. Isn't that just an amazing story? That just is astounding to me.
Sandy?
Yes.
This makes me think of when the Nazis overran France, the French people hid a lot of the paintings from the Louvre.
Yes.
And I can only wish that they had done that with the museum in Singapore.
Oh, yeah.
Tried to hide those paintings because he's wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they had stored all that. All of it was ready to be shipped, and they had stored them in this school, and fearful of Japanese overrunning, because the Japanese attacked Singapore just like they did Pearl Harbor, and fearful of being overrun by the Japanese, that school destroyed 40 paintings, all 40. So there would be no Xu Beihong exhibit in the United States until 2011. Amazing. You probably heard me get a little choked up. So following World War II, during and following World War II, Xu Beihong was dedicated to promoting Chinese art and encouraging talented artists. He organized the Chinese Art Research Institute. He became the president of the National Art Academy in Beijing. He was the president of the Central Academy of Fine Arts. He attended the World Peace Conference in Prague. World famous artist you never heard of. And as an art teacher, he emphasized the importance of the artist's experience in life, and he encouraged studying nature and painting from nature. He's responsible for the direction taken in modern Chinese art world, and he's taken some criticism from this, that China has not progressed, if you will, into the modern art, because some people are still adhering to the direction that Xu Beihong took Chinese art into. But you can't help but think without his direction, it wouldn't have moved at all. You know, without his going to Europe and studying and bringing what he brought back and getting out of copying rather than creating. So, you know, he probably did take it at least some steps forward, if you will. His policies enacted at the beginning of the Communist era continue to control the government policies toward art. So he did have a lot of influence. You know, working with the communist government could not have been easy for anybody. So I'm sure there's critics out there who say, you know, that hasn't been as freewheeling as maybe it could have, but within the confines of the government, what could you do? So I'm sure he did what he could. This was a charcoal and ink wash on paper that he did of Chairman Mao. He hired a young librarian named Liao Jingwen, and he married her in 1946. They had 2 children, a son, Xu Qingping, and a daughter, Xu Fangfang. Xu Beihong himself died of a stroke in September 1953. And after his death, the Xu Beihong Museum was established at his home in Beijing. The Xu Beihong Museum was in his residence, and his wife, Liao Zhengwen, donated more than 1,200 of his original sketches and ink brush paintings and oils and drawings to the Chinese government. Oh, excuse me. She also donated his entire personal collection, including more than 1,000 pieces of artwork, which included calligraphy and paintings done by Chinese and Western artists. He had gathered an immense collection over the years that he had collected in Europe and his travels through Russia, Europe, and Southeast Asia. The Xu Beihong Museum is the first art museum in China dedicated to a single artist and funded by the government. But it wasn't without its struggles. In 1966, during the Cultural Revolution, Liao Jingwen, his third wife, that was the librarian that he hired and then subsequently married, his third wife, she had contacted Chao Enlai, who was a friend of Xu Beihong's, regarding the preservation of Xu Beihong's art. The Red Guard had come into Xu Beihong's museum several times and destroyed some of the artwork there. They actually abused Liao Jingwen and tried to implicate her in several plots, if you will. Liao Jingwen contacted Chao Enlai asking for help. And at Chao Enlai's direction, all the art in the museum was packed up and moved to the Forbidden City where it was guarded. So luckily, Xu Beihong and subsequently his wife had that connection to Chao Enlai, where the art could be protected and saved. And his art remained in the Forbidden City until it was safe to move it back to the museum. So again, I mean, this whole thing just reads almost like a soap opera. I mean, during this Cultural Revolution, there was a chance that all of this would have been destroyed. And in fact, some of it was, but the majority of it was in fact rescued and stored in the Forbidden City. Isn't that amazing? Just think of what the loss would be at that point. It's just astounding. In fact, Liao Jingwen, third wife, wrote his biography called Xu Beihong, Life of a Master Painter. She passed away in 2015 at the age 92. And then Xu Fangfang published her book, Galloping Horses, just in 2016. And Xu Fangfang's book details how her father's family and the legacies survived in Mao's China. In fact, Xu Fangfang was actually sent to one of the farm camps for several years. She was a very talented musician, a violinist and a pianist, and was sent to one of these farm camps for several years. And she details in her book how her mother, Xu Beihong's third wife, worked to establish the Xu Beihong Museum and keep it going. Today, Xu Qingping, Xu Fangfang's brother, actually runs the museum in Beijing and has close ties to the museum in Beijing. So this is Liao Jingwen, who authored the book Life of a Master Painter. And this is Xu Fangfang, author of Galloping Horses. And in 2011, the first exhibit of Xu Beihong art in the United States was exclusively at the Denver Art Museum. The date was while the Xu Beihong Museum was undergoing renovations. So it was a win-win for both the Denver Art Museum and the Xu Beihong Museum. So while they were renovating Xu Beihong, a lot of the art was brought to Denver to be displayed. And it was primarily arranged by Denver Art Museum trustee John C., whose father was a good friend of Xu Beihong's, and his father, John C.'s father, appeared in that painting, Tian Heng and his 500 followers, remember? So again, you got these ties. This is like a soap opera. They actually brought 61 pieces of Xu Beihong's art to Denver, including one piece from 1918, which was a very early piece. It included 6 galloping horses, that huge piece, and it included Tian Heng and his 500 followers, the piece that John C.'s father is actually in. Isn't that something? So that was the first and only exhibit that has ever been in the United States of Xu Beihong's artwork. Isn't that wonderful? And there it is again. So, and that's John C.'s father right there. Isn't that amazing? And that's the one, the 6 galloping horses, which is huge. I got to go up to Denver to see this. I sat in front of this painting for I don't know how long. I would have gone up a second time had I had the time to do it, but I was just overwhelmed by it, just overwhelmed by the whole thing. And of course, he's famous all across the world. There's stamps all over. China, Macau, Maldives, Micronesia, Gambia. You get stamps of, the galloping horses are just the most famous ones, of course. Just stamps of him all over from all over the world. You find stamps, especially the horses. There's 3 horses in art. And of course, this one, horse grazing, this actually sold at Christie's auction in 2015 for $61,000. Beautiful painting. This one, standing horse, sold in 2012 at Christie's. It was estimated to be upward of $78,000. It actually sold for $80,000. This one, the artist known for his focus on horses, this one, a 1934 ink and color on skull, sold for $3 million at Christie's. $3 million. Isn't that amazing? This one of a Chinese warrior is estimated, almost $500,000, $450,000. Ink and color on paper. Scenes inspired by Yu Xing's poetic sentiment. This was made in 1939. This sold at Christie's in 2016 for over $4 million. And it all started with me getting that little picture of a group of horses, from seeing that rug down here at the Chinese restaurant, and then getting that painting there in Germany and following the trail, if you will, and coming across this world famous artist I certainly had never heard of, and then learning more and more about him. And Xu Beihong, 1895 to 1953.